All right. Well, we just want to welcome you guys out to our Office Manager Study Group. We are really excited to be here tonight and offer some business advice and some instruction for office managers. We know that this doesn't happen a large amount, and we really want to invest into you guys and allow you guys the opportunity to learn a bit. We have an awesome speaker with us tonight, and we're super pumped because Sina is amazing. Sina has been in the dental field for a long time, started off in the real estate side of things, and it really has grown into kind of I don't want to say it's an obsession that he has, but he's really networked a huge amount and has really done a lot of great things in dental and a really great resource. And if you are on LinkedIn, I would suggest following him, because that's how I get all of my news updates, because he constantly posts things that are happening all over North America in dentistry. He's a great resource for networking with people. He knows a lot about the DSO world, which is dental support organizations, which sometimes we refer to as corporate dentistry for those who are unfamiliar with that term. He has his own company that he works with other companies to help build their programs. And one of the things that he works with right now is EDMS, which is an analytics company, and they help kind of highlight areas of the clinic that help us grow and manage from that information. So with that, I will turn the time over to Sina and allow him to kind of guide us on this learning journey tonight.
Perfect. Well, thanks a lot, Teresa, for the wonderful opportunity to be here and to present about the topic tonight, which is key performance indicators. So I'll just go ahead here and just share my screen with you. And can everybody see it?
Yeah, it's good.
Perfect. So let's get started. So the topic for today's session is KPIs for dental practices. And I thought before I get into key performance indicators, just give you an overall understanding of my lens as far as how I approach the management of a dental clinic. So I spent, as Teresa mentioned, quite a bit of time in the dental industry, 10 years, and 15 years in total has been in the healthcare industry. So I actually started prior to getting into dental, working with hospitals and health systems, so medical side of the industry, and primarily was involved with the implementation of technology solutions within hospitals and health systems. And a company that I joined back in 2012 had a dental, medical, and a veterinary division, and they ended up assigning me to the dental division, and really became quite interested with dentistry because of the entrepreneurial nature of it. Having worked with hospitals and health systems prior to 2012, I was exposed to larger organizations, and with that obviously comes a lot of potential red tape and just harder to get technology implemented because you're dealing with so many different decision makers. I've served as well as a VP of clinical operations at a national DSO, and that DSO had practices ranging in size from 4 to 18 treatment rooms. Primarily, they were located in Ontario and Quebec. And one thing I want to highlight is everything I'm presenting today does relate to what's happened with the pandemic, because in my personal case, I did manage these practices both during the shutdown for elective procedures and also was responsible for reopening them once the mandates changed. So I think we're all going through a high degree of issues with COVID-19. A lot of it has to do obviously with staffing and not being able to find the right people when you need them. I've also worked with dentist entrepreneurs across Canada, including Alberta. There's a couple of dental groups that I've had direct exposure to. So I do understand how the market in Alberta is a little bit different than some other provinces. As far as the agenda for today, we're going to discuss what are the main categories of key performance indicators that you need to track. We're also going to go over the benefits of tracking KPIs, what are the common pitfalls that you should avoid when you're trying to measure these metrics, as well as what are the best practices around implementing KPI tracking within your clinic. And then I want to get into some sample key performance indicators that I think are important, and then we'll take questions as well in the end. But just to start off, maybe we can get a quick kind of poll going. How many people today are actually managing key performance indicators and reporting on those key performance indicators in their practice?
You can just put it through the chat if you guys want. You can just put here, or you can raise your hand.
Yeah, either one works for me, and feel free to chime in as well. So I find that, you know, there are practices that track their KPIs, but there's still a lot of clinics that aren't. And I think a lot of it has to do with difficulty in pulling the data out of the practice management software. So the way that I kind of break down the importance of tracking KPIs is by looking at financial, clinical, as well as operational metrics. And the benefits of tracking these KPIs are multitude. First and foremost, tracking them actually allows your organization, your dental practice, to understand whether or not you're achieving your vision and mission. So I like key performance indicators that are tied to the overall mission of the practice. And if you haven't defined a mission, my recommendation is to get together with your team and go through an exercise of defining what is your purpose, right? And your purpose could be, we're going to impact the access to oral care in our particular city or community. But it is really personal to your clinic, right? No two practices may have an identical mission. The other reason why you want to actually track these key performance indicators is there's a saying, you know, what gets measured gets improved. And that was a saying that Peter Drucker is attributed to. And the importance here is that you are able to understand whether or not the needle is moving in the right direction with regards to things such as patient care. So through tracking these KPIs, you can identify opportunities for patient care. It's not just about revenue and profitability. It's really about making sure that you're able to understand, are we impacting more lives as a result of what we're doing? And then in addition to that, having KPIs allows you to have team accountability. It's also a great way to keep the team motivated because they can compare how they're doing relative to prior months or prior years. And my recommendation is that you're creating rewards for them. They don't necessarily have to be monetary in nature. They could be something as simple as, you know, if we achieve this particular new patient review rate, we're going to go out for dinner and we're going to celebrate. You also want to ensure that you're able to meet payroll and other recurring expenses, as well as forecast cash flows. So what I've seen with the pandemic is that the practices that weren't necessarily tracking their KPIs were taken a little bit by surprise, because when it came time to having a conversation, for example, with your bank around cost cutting or cost savings, they weren't necessarily sure what levers to pull within the clinic. And so having KPIs at your fingertips does allow you to make some tough decisions when needed. And then it also allows you to better communicate with external stakeholders. It could be banks, could be accountants that you're speaking with. Some of these conversations obviously are happening between the dentist and these external stakeholders, but it's good for the owner to understand where the practice is today and what sort of financing it may need going forward in order to make those conversations much easier.
I think, Sina, sorry, if I can just interject a little bit.
Yes.
I think it's important too, like, and before we started this, Sina said to me, just so you guys are aware, that he is very much in realization that not every office manager has control over all of these things, but all of these things do operate a dental clinic. So whether or not this falls into your scope of management or future management, it's good for you guys to have a good understanding of all of these things, because they all influence final decisions. They influence the flow and operations of the clinic and the direction of the clinic, like he was referring to in the earlier points there. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. And I would say that if you're not privy to the current financial picture of the clinic, we can maybe talk in the end about how do you get buy-in from the owner as far as why it's important for you to view the numbers. But there are a lot of KPIs that exist within the practice management software that, if reported on, will still give you a good sense of what's happening in the clinic. I find a lot of practices are underutilizing these reports, primarily because the practice management software systems were not designed necessarily for analytics. And this is exactly why the company that I advise, which is EDMS, decided to build a data analytics platform to be able to make reporting off of the practice management software much easier and much more user-friendly. So some of the common pitfalls with dental practices as far as KPIs that I see are, we see practices that don't actually track any key performance indicators. And this could be because the doctor owner doesn't believe in it, prefers to go based on feeling and feels that they have already a good grasp of what's happening in the clinic because they're working chair side all day. I also see practices saying that it's too time consuming to track and report on the KPIs, which is a fair argument because, tabulating this data in an Excel spreadsheet does take time. There's also practices that are unfamiliar, the staff are unfamiliar with the practice management or the data analytics software. And so this comes down to training. Have you actually gone through formal training on the practice management system? If not, can you allocate some time to do that? And what's the payback around it? And then big issue with practices that do track their KPIs is they track a lot of KPIs without an emphasis on which ones to improve. So in the introduction, Teresa mentioned that I have experience either working at or advising dental groups. And so one of the things that I've seen is a obsession in some cases with KPIs without actually selecting those that are important. And so what happens is when they're talked about, the team members get overwhelmed because all of a sudden the dentist entrepreneur or the corporate dental group wants all of these KPIs tracked, and it's hard for the team members to know, what do I focus on today? So when I'm working, for example, front desk and the phone rings and it could be a new patient, do I answer it? Do I check out the existing patient? Do I help with perhaps a treatment presentation discussion? And so what happens throughout the clinic and how do I prioritize my time? An analogy I'll use is, Disney today, when they train their employees, the most important metric that they look at is guest safety. So if there's a kid crying and has lost her parent, the particular person working that day, if somebody's looking to buy a ticket, they're going to go take care of that child first before they sell a ticket for a vacation package to the couple that wants to book their trip for next year. And so defining that is really important within the practice. And if you have an owner that's focused on a lot of KPIs, I think it's important to have a conversation around which ones we're going to focus on this particular week or month or year. And the other issue that I see is that only the practice owner is privy to the KPIs, like Teresa was mentioning. So, I'm aware that there's a lot of dental office managers that may not have direct access to the data. And if any of you want to follow up with me offline, I can give you some tips and recommendations around how to get around this. It does come down to the individual provider. So I'll need to ask some questions around who they are and their personality to give you a better perspective on what I would do in your specific case. And then KPIs, I see sometimes aren't tied to the organization's mission, vision, and values. And this goes back to my earlier statement in that if you don't have a mission statement for your clinic, it would be highly recommended to get together with your team to discuss that. And then once you come up with that, it's going to be much easier to tie some KPIs to it. And also, another issue that I've seen is that the practice owner doesn't reward team members all the time for achieving KPIs. This is in some clinics where you may have KPIs tracked, these metrics are being reported on, but as I like to say, there's nothing in it for the team members. And the question here is, can there be small rewards put in place that not necessarily costs the practice $100,000, but actually go a long way to helping celebrate those small wins. And then the other issue that I see is that the practices that do track their KPIs, oftentimes the doctor is, worried about how they're performing month over month. Yet when I look at the numbers, what I notice is that for the KPIs that are underperforming, there has not been any new initiatives around skills training. So it's not just a matter of improving KPIs. It's hard to improve them, frankly, if you don't invest in skills training, primarily because most of these key performance indicators are tied to the individual ability of the team members, as well as the collective ability of the team members to make the patient experience better. And so one of the questions that I often pose to dentists and practice owners is, now that you're tracking KPIs, what are you actually doing to improve them? And what deficiencies have you identified? What skills are required to overcome those deficiencies by function? And then what do we need to do to get there? What courses or what training programs do we need to put in place in order to level up the staff and the team members to get to that point?
Yeah, if I can interject here again, Sina, sorry. I just think that a lot of times, at least when my personal experience with KPIs and working in DSOs teaches you a lot about KPIs, which is awesome. That's where I got a lot of my groundwork done. But knowing what to do with the numbers, they're just numbers if you don't use them, and knowing how to incorporate them in your operations day to day, and not necessarily like getting overwhelmed by the biggest full picture of them, but like you said, breaking it into smaller things and working at things piece by piece, and tied to missions, tied to your values. I think that's like a really, really important part of this whole slide that you're looking at right now, because if it's not tied to anything, no one sees value in it. And if you're trying to motivate a team to do anything, they have to see value in it. It can't just be more work. It has to be something that they think is going to get them some sort of reward in the end. And I don't mean financial reward, although that's nice if you can do that. But I think it has a lot to do with some sort of payoff, some sort of success, some sort of achievement, to get the real value out of tracking KPIs and motivating your team to continue to track them.
Yeah, well said. Because we're all human, right? And so if we don't see anything for us with regards to this plan, it's hard to want to obtain buy-in. And many times it's not even about the individual, it's about knowing whether or not the work you're doing day to day is actually helping the patient. And so there's the intrinsic driver. And I know a few practice owners that are big believers in not necessarily bonus systems and incentive compensation, but rather, using KPIs to determine whether or not it's appropriate to increase staff wages so that they're being rewarded essentially through the base salary rather than incentives that may drive certain type of behavior that may result in overtreatment. And so there's more than one way to reward the team members without having negative consequences. And that's part of what I'm trying to do in terms of educating doctors around KPIs and why they're important. And then in terms of best practices, I often speak with practice owners regarding, are you obtaining team member input on the development of the KPIs? So this doesn't have to be an exercise that only the office administrator or manager or the practice owner goes through. It can actually be a collective exercise. You can get together with your dental assistants, your hygienists, your administrative support team, and also, speak with Teresa, because she's probably got a really good handle on, given her experience, what sorts of KPIs you should be tracking. And she can also give you some benchmark data around, whether or not your practice's performance is in line with what she's seeing in the Alberta economy. I also like to make sure that practices are reviewing their KPIs on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis during meetings. So if you have your morning huddle, you can incorporate some of these key performance indicators into that morning huddle. If you don't have a template for that morning huddle, again, I'm sure that if you reach out to Teresa, she'll be able to help guide you on either how to create one or give you a template. And then one of the issues that I see when KPIs are being tracked, anytime you're tracking metrics, there's again a tendency to want to track everything. And although the more KPIs you track, the better, what I try to focus on when I speak with teams is make sure that you are really focused on like 2 or 3 key metrics rather than 12 at any given time, because you can only improve so much, right? So if you focus on 3 KPIs per function at any given time, you're much more likely to get results, in my opinion, because you're much more focused as far as what you're looking to improve in that given month. And then you also want to celebrate your wins. So have a conversation with the practice owner around, what does the improvement in this particular metric mean for him or her financially and the practice's health? And then what can we do to incentivize or take care of the team members? And that, again, doesn't have to be necessarily cash. It could be something as simple as having a team outing. And you also want to look at your KPIs relative to industry averages. I will provide you with some of the more common metrics that I see tracked in dental practices that are measuring your performance and what are the rough averages that I'm seeing in the market. And you also want to invest in skills training, as I mentioned. And then I'm a big believer in using KPIs for positive reinforcement, not using it as a stick. And I know that sometimes it can be very discouraging when a dental clinic starts looking at metrics and the numbers are far below industry average, for the owner to then get upset or perhaps use it as a negative measure rather than looking at it from a perspective of here's where we are today. Let's actually collectively discuss what's not working, right? And set some realistic timelines. And a key word here is realistic, because every province and every town is unique. And the type of practice you run is unique. So I talked to oral surgeons during the pandemic that said to me, I've had my best month and best year. Well, oral surgery is different than a GP clinic, right? Is different than a pediatric practice. And so when you're looking at comparing your metrics, you want to make sure that you're comparing yourself to practices in similar demographic areas, as well as practices in similar specialties.
And I think it's also important to remember to gauge the skill level of your team, because that has a huge impact on your KPIs achievability. And like you said, a realistic goal can be fashioned around the skill level of your team. Like a very high functioning surgical team is going to be able to produce a huge amount of production, but a lower functioning team is not going to be able to do the same thing. And so the timelines are going to be variable depending on who is your team and how hard they work and how much training they have and all the things that kind of go into people management. That's kind of, I think, too, what you were getting at in the skills development in that kind of area.
Exactly. And in terms of the KPIs that you can track, so I'll start with financial KPIs. Sometimes I call these business KPIs. So these are more related to the profit and loss of a dental clinic. So you may hear the owner of your practice discussing gross production. Generally, most owners and their accountants look at gross production relative to dental, as well as gross production relative to hygiene. And so in a healthy practice, something along the lines of 35 to 40% of the total gross revenue or production of the clinic can come from hygiene if it's a general practice. But there is a variance around this. So if a practice is only doing 20% of their gross production because of hygiene, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad practice. It all depends on what the owner's philosophy is. The higher generally the hygiene production is, when you go to sell the practice, the more buyers there are for it, because it's generally perceived that it's easier to continue running the hygiene operations as is when there is a change in dentists, primarily because hygiene is the type of service that patients are coming back with on a recurring basis. And today's hygiene, patient becomes tomorrow's restorative patient, in the sense that hygiene is where a lot of opportunities for patient care on the dental side are identified. We also, and by the way, any questions around gross production and why that's tracked within a dental practice? Okay. So the other financial indicator that I like to look at is overhead expenses as a percentage of revenue and collections. And overhead expenses are such expenses as employee salaries. And prior to the pandemic, the average practice, general practice, was spending about 27 to 29% of their total revenue on employee salaries. Another 8 to 12% of their total revenue or collections. Sometimes practices don't have as much of a gap between revenue and collections, so that's why I use those interchangeably. But for these ratios, I'm going to use revenue as the key indicator. So office rent as a percentage of revenue, most offices prior to the pandemic were hovering around 8 to 12%. If the doctor owns the building, depending on the mortgage amount, this could be less, but it all depends on whether your practice is located in a plaza, is it in a medical building, is it in a retail location with high visibility. So the better the location, generally the higher the rent. And most practices that end up paying a higher rent rate tend to make up for it in less marketing and advertising, particularly if it's located in a major intersection. And then you have lab fees, and historically, they range from 8 to 10%. But again, you can have some economy of scale depending on the number of clinics that you have and the type of relationship that you have with your lab provider. And then dental supplies historically average about 5%. Again, it's not a hard number. I know that practices with PPE spending, depending on if they're providing N95s to, say, hygienists, this cost could be substantially higher. In fact, during the pandemic, we saw this number get closer to 7-8% of total revenue in most clinics. And then marketing and advertising expenses as a percentage of revenue do vary depending on whether or not the dentist is in growth mode, or perhaps they already have 2,000 active patients and they can't handle, because of the number of operatories and treatment rooms that they have, they actually can't handle any more patients. And so marketing expenses can be as low as 1% to as much as 3 to 5% of your revenue for an established clinic. Obviously, if the practice was only built in the last 3 to 5 years, this number can be significantly higher.
For lab fees, what was the percentage again?
So the lab fees, when I managed a DSO, we were averaging 8 to 10% of total revenue.
Okay.
And in our case, we had multiple practices, so we were on the lower end just because of the fact that we consolidated some of the labs that we use. But it also varies by region, because obviously quality of the lab is important. And so one of the things that we looked at was, what percentage of the time are we having to deal with quality assurance issues related to the lab? And maybe we're saving money on the front end, but we're having to deal with a lot of headaches administratively because the lab that we're using isn't the best lab. And then I had a question from Mona. What are the good target percentages for dental supplies? So pre-pandemic, it was about 5% of total revenue or production. I think today, if you're averaging, 7 to 8%, it's still fine. But overall, I think you need to look at it this way. If your supply costs, and this is why everything's proportional, if your supply costs have gone up, right? So a couple of things need to happen in order for you to maintain the same profitability. either your revenue has gone up proportionately or you've reduced expenses. For example, perhaps the landlord gave you a rent abatement because of the difficulty in the pandemic and what happened with commercial real estate. They may have been much more amenable, right, to giving rent reductions or rent abatements, or alternatively, you took advantage of the government program and you got a subsidy. So my recommendation is that if you see one of these costs creep up above the average that I stated, don't necessarily be alarmed. Look at it holistically and look at other areas of the practice where you can either generate additional revenue or sustainably reduce expenses. And rent is a good example of that during the pandemic, because what I found was, although my supply costs had gone up, the landlords that I dealt with were open to discussions around how to make the rent much more palatable. And then employee salaries have also gone up since the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, the average general practice was spending about 28 to 29% of their total revenue. So for every dollar they produce, 28 to 29% of that would go towards salaries. That's gone up to north of 30%. And some practices have seen an increase in production, other ones haven't. And so what happens when that occurs is it impacts what is called Ebitda. And Ebitda stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Much more simpler way to explain this is it's the operating cash flow. It measures essentially the health, the financial health of the practice. So in a typical GP practice, the margin on Ebitda is about 20 to 35%, depending on the type of clinic that you're managing. And what's happened because of the pandemic is that that Ebitda number has shrunk to be on the lower end of that range. It can eventually recover because, the thinking is that eventually we'll get out of this pandemic, although we will be in a new normal. The price inflation that we're seeing may get stabilized. One of the things I want to point out as well is that a lot of practices did raise their fees as a result of increased expenses. So for example, when their dental expenses on the supply side went up, they decided to perhaps raise their fees above the fee guide or pass on the expense to the patient. But this is an exercise that's very dependent on your particular office and whether or not you feel relative to the competition, your patients are willing to pay above the fee guide slightly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think Mona said yes. I think that too, it's important to point out that obviously this is completely variable. The more production you make, that's going to change the percentage of what you're doing in the clinic. If you keep your costs lower, but you make more money, they're going to see a higher Ebitda. But the other thing I wanted to point out as well as dental supplies, I think for just Alberta, for you guys that are here, and obviously most of you are in Alberta, most of my production forgives everything. Well, sometimes, but I think for most people in Alberta, I've been suggesting around 6% dental supply is a really good zone to be in right now. I know most people are shopping around for their dental supplies to keep it within that happy margin. But if you're around the 6%, you're in a really good position in dental supplies right now. I think that you're managing it very well. If you're getting up into the 8, 9, 10%, you need to take a look at what you're doing to see if there is excess buying, which is happening a lot, and things are going to waste. That's something that's super important. And then there's also the thing to think about is if you're doing a high amount of implants, that's going to screw up your percentage of production a little bit, because you tend to buy the implant supplies before you do the production. And so it might change variable month to month, but you might have to look at it at quarters versus doing it monthly. We're at 6% this month, and then all of a sudden we're at, 12%, but you had to buy a bunch of implant supplies that you're replacing the next month when your production came in. So you might have to look at things in a quarterly fashion versus a monthly fashion to really get a good idea of what's happening in those numbers. But you should be reviewing them overall every month just to make sure they're not getting out of control either direction. And you're being able to see a reflection of that in your production to make sure that you are staying on track.
Yeah, and that's a good point. When I joined the dental group at the time, they were managing their supply budget. It was set to be 4.5% of the collections. And one of the things that I noticed was that obviously months where we purchased implant inventory, that number obviously skyrocketed. So you could carry the balance forward, whether negative or positive, to the next month. But I do like to look at this more on a quarterly basis, because I think that oftentimes looking at it from a monthly basis doesn't necessarily indicate what's really happening with the practice, especially if you've done bulk buying of PPE. And as Teresa mentioned, you have a practice that spends more money on implants as well as orthodontic supplies, both of which are not inexpensive. And then as far as operational KPIs, and I love how somebody just commented, production forgives everything. There's a lot of truth to that. And there's more than one way to achieve the end profit goal for a clinic. And so if you're boosting your total production, you're not necessarily as worried about these smaller expenses. Because every practice has a break-even point, and beyond that break-even point, every dollar that the practice produces flows right through the bottom line in terms of profitability. And so one of the things you may want to look at is what is the break-even point for our clinic. And although a lot of practice owners may not be comfortable sharing the actual financial statements with you, they may be okay telling you that on a monthly basis, we need to produce $50,000 just to break even on our current overhead expenses, which includes things like rent, staff salaries, and aggregate supplies, etc. And then when it comes to operational KPIs, one of the most common ones that is tracked is production per available and production per booked hour. So available means, hygienist is set to work 9 to 5. So they have let's say 1 hour break. And so there's 7 hours that are available, but truly they're only booked to see patients, let's say 4 hours in a day. So in order to be able to compare the production equally, you do need to look at it in intervals of time, and you need to be able to compare one hygienist to another if you're doing the comparison relative to the hours that they actually worked. And more importantly, if they were booked for certain hours, that number is going to be much higher, right, than the total available hours as far as the production. And depending on the type of practice you have, the owner may decide, I'm going to create some benchmarks for the hygienists as well as for the associates, if you have associates in the clinic, around production per available and booked hour. And those numbers are reviewed with the team, and the goal here is to improve them. So I'll leave it at that. I won't get into much more detail than that. But if you do have any questions around this particular metric and how it's measured or not measured in your clinic, let me know. And then new patients per full-time dentist. So I like to have 20 to 45 new patients per full-time dentist. Now, I'm mindful that if your schedule is already full, then they may not be a point in getting 25 to 40 patients, right, into the clinic. And so it all depends on the life cycle of the practice. There is natural attrition. So one of the things that I tell a lot of practice owners, especially now, with the degree of, so the number, the question was, is that per month? So the 20 to, and this is again a wide range, the 20 to 45, patients a month, certainly less than 50 in most cases per full-time dentist. That number is per month. But keep in mind that, again, depending on how long the practice has been established and how full the schedule is, this may not be a realistic number, right? The one thing you want to look at is the attrition rate within your clinic. So what I mean by that is how many patients on a monthly basis are closing their file because they're either moving away, right? Or they've decided for whatever reason to select a different dentist. And so if you're not tracking the patient attrition rate, the new patient rate per full-time dentist is kind of irrelevant, because you could get, let's say, 45 new patients that month, but if you lost 90 patients, right, in that same month, you're in the negative, right? And so one of the things I've seen with practices that change hands is that a new dentist comes in, and because they have a different treatment philosophy, or the patients are not, loyal to the rest of the team, there is attrition. And so I advise those doctors, you got to boost your new patient volume. Why? Because you have a backdoor issue. There's patients leaving the clinic more than there are patients joining the clinic. So when I was managing a dental group, we looked at this number relative to patient attrition to get a sense of what is our aggregate new patient volume? Are we trending up or down in a given month? And then you also want to look at patients by referral source. So take a look at, where are we getting these patients? If you're doing any sort of marketing campaigns, ideally, when a patient's calling to book an appointment, you're asking how they heard about the practice, and you're noting that down, and you're aggregating that data on a monthly basis. We also look at total accounts receivable as a percentage of prior month's collections. I like to look at 0 to 30, 31 to 60, 61 to 90, just to get a sense of how is the AR trending on the patient side on a given month. And obviously, if AR is going above 90 days, it's going to be much more hard to collect it. So there's some stats around the declining return rate on AR the longer that it ages. And my recommendation here is that you pay attention to the 60 plus AR, because at some point you may have to send that to collections, and the return on what you're paying a collections agency may not necessarily be worth it depending on the amount that's owed. Not to mention the fact that if you have a high AR, it's generally indicative of some sort of breakdown in the patient experience or how you're doing things like checkout, for example. And Teresa, any comments on AR in particular, given what you've seen in practices these days?
So I have seen both sides of the story recently. So I've seen clinics that have no AR and they're like on top of it, and really, really good systems in place for that, and really good patient communication overall. And they're, working on making sure that the patient, like you said, the patient experience is very good. And that's been awesome to see. But I've also seen the extreme other direction where no system is in place, no good patient communication, even in how they deal with AR as far as like collections. And we can obviously, that's like a whole hole itself to go down. But I feel like patient interaction on how they're collecting hasn't been as good. And I feel like during the pandemic, a lot of dental clinics didn't put a huge amount of emphasis on collecting the money. They were just focused on dealing with the patient flow and the stress of what was going on in the clinic. And I think systems broke down, and we're seeing them trying to collect the money. But also, what's interesting fact, and I learned this when I was, thrown an AR mess when I was an office manager in a clinic, and I had to deal with it all, as like the dentists pay taxes on that money and they're not collecting on it. So if you ever had a dentist ride your butt about AR, that's why, because they're paying taxes on that money that they aren't probably going to see, because after 90 days, the chances of you getting that money back is like really, really low. So, creating those systems and structures is like crazy important. And collecting the money the same day is like, even if it's a small amount of the copay, even if you're guessing at it, is probably still a better system than letting it go if you're waiting for second insurance and such. Just having that communication on hand is like super important, because I've just seen it drastically get out of control, and then trying to gain ground back is like, it's an upward battle, and it requires so much time and energy, and it's really difficult to get back on track. Not impossible, but you're talking, instead of collecting the money the same day or within the same, 30 or 60 days, you're now taking a year to get the whole clinic systems worked out, to get back on track, to continue to keep that AR manageable.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I look at the cost of recovering AR. So meaning, if you're paying, let's say, collections agency, like what is your fee, and what are you left with at the end of the day, right? And so sometimes those calls that the collection agencies make, not sometimes, a lot of times, you may get the money, but you'll never get the patient back. And so, it's a matter of looking at it through the patient's lens and determining at this point in time, what is the likelihood to actually come back to the clinic. And then there are some issues with AR that can be overcome simply by being a little bit more selective with regards to what new patients enroll. I've seen marketing campaigns that are purported to drive new patients, but those patients may not necessarily be the best fit for the practice. And so I often look at even the marketing that's getting done in the clinic to find out potentially what types of patients are we getting in to the clinic, and is that something that's conducive to growing the practice. And then on the patient acquisition front, what is the cost to acquire a new patient is another indicator. I would probably bucket this more under the financial category rather than the operational, although I have it in operational on the slide. And this is all around, if we do a marketing campaign or advertising campaign, how much does it cost for us to bring a new patient in? And this ranges from a total of around, on the low end, $80 to as high as $600, depending on the type of patient. So what I mean by that is, if you're doing, let's say, all on fours, and you're generating a new patient for that type of treatment, you can probably expect to pay closer to $600 to acquire that patient. Whereas if you're looking to get a hygiene patient or new patient exam, it's probably going to be closer to the lower end of that range. And 80 is the best that I've seen in most practices. If you're doing $80 to acquire a new patient, I think it's phenomenal. I've seen lower than that, but I think on average, most practices are spending about $200 per patient. Is that what you're seeing as well, Teresa, in your experience?
Yeah, I think that would be on the accurate side of things, like $200. I think most people have like a Google ads campaign or whatever, and they're seeing a few people trickle in from there. But most of it, I think, and I feel like maybe I might be out to lunch on this, but I feel like most of the best referrals or new patients that we get that are like the cheapest would be like in-office referral base. So like extended family members and all that kind of stuff. There was a question here. What about lots of patients are Alberta Works or First Nations? Do you mean that how much do those new patients cost? Because I feel like those just file in anyway. Like, I'm not sure what you mean by that question.
Yeah, those would be, so I have some experience in Ontario with Ontario Disability Support Program. And so what I found generally is that not all of these patients are accepted at any clinic, because there's some doctors that unfortunately choose not to accept those patients. And so in most cases, I found that if you actually call the city or the government program and let them know that your practice is accepting those patients, they're like more than happy to refer them over. And the cost to acquire those patients is relatively low. Now, mind you, there is also a cap sometimes on what the production associated with those patients is, which is fine. You just have to define, are we going to be focused on volume? Or are we going to be focused on, larger treatments and less patients? And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. It all depends on the type of practice. And again, going back to your mission statement, what is your ultimate goal in the community that you're in?
I can answer this for you, Mona. I live in Wetaskiwin, and we are largely First Nations out here. And the clinic that I grew was mostly brought in by First Nations and ADSC, but we had quite a bit of other patients come in filter afterwards. But we built our model to reflect those type of patients in the sense that we would have a certain amount of patient scheduled days that we could see them. So they were allowed to book 10% of the day, and we would push them into those spots to get them in. And I know you're asking about retaining them or increasing their no-show rate or their show-up rate. So we had just structured a cancellation policy. It's a 3 strikes, 0 policy. First one is you didn't show up. You get a conversation and a follow-up call, and sorry, you couldn't make your appointment. You weren't able to do this, whatever you want to say, however you want to say it. But you let them know that now there's a policy in place for this and you're unable to attend. I'm so sorry to hear that. However, this is the policy, and you make it very clear, and you send a follow-up text or email so that you have a written document of it. Then the second one, if they have a no-show again, then you would follow up. Same thing. Okay, now, unfortunately, because of this no-show, the second time around, we are unable to see you in the practice on a regular booking day. You would have to call the clinic the day of to see if there's something available, or you will have to go on a short notice cancellation list. And if you have like a texting service that has a cancellation list, you would add them onto that program. And then you would bring them back into the clinic when it works for you versus having them constantly no show on your schedule. And you just build that program out until everyone understands it. And every new patient that comes in that is that demographic, I guess you would say, then you would let them know that this is the cancellation policy. This is what it is. There's a 3 strikes, you're out policy. We require this much notice, and that way everyone is clear and you have a set program and system and structure in place for that. And it worked very, very well. We kind of ended up having those patients as our bread and butter, I guess, patients, where they were able to come in short notice. They were able to fill holes for us. And we would have 30 or 40 people on a list that we would call on, send out a text. They would flaunt, yeah, I'm good. And they would show up to their appointment and then get back on track. And then you teach them how to be respectful of the dentist time or hygienist time or your clinic schedule.
And I noticed somebody commented that they use Recall Max for texting. So I know the team there quite well. And having these sorts of tools definitely helps when it comes to hygiene recall, as well as kind of managing short lists and no-shows and cancellations. And then on my end, if anybody's interested in getting more data on these trend lines, more than happy to put you in contact with the EDMS Dentalytics team that essentially integrates their analytics software with any practice management system that you're using. And then the last one that I like to look at on this list are employee turnover rate by function. And so this is one that I find, and I don't know, Teresa, your experience, but in my experience, I would say that more than well over 80% of the doctors that I speak with don't really track their turnover rate. They know I lost, Mary at the front desk, but they're not really tracking it over the many years that they're practicing dentistry. And I think once you put this on a piece of paper, on a spreadsheet, you kind of tend to realize, you know what, better to keep my employees than to lose them, even if it means, I have to agree to that particular raise that they're asking for, primarily because the cost of training the team members is quite high. And obviously turnover, particularly on the hygiene and DDS front, does affect patient retention. And so I like to talk to owners around what are you doing to not only measure your turnover rate, but how are you preventing turnover in your clinic? And are you actually conducting exit interviews that allow you to distill why you're losing team members?
Yeah, for me, I'm finding no one tracks it. No one, absolutely no one tracks it.
Yeah.
They just say, yeah, this person doesn't make it. And it's good. It's good to see it on paper because just like all KPIs, it allows you to start asking questions and looking at things. And if you're asking, well, why have we lost 3 receptionists in the last year? Well, maybe because they're overworked or burnt out. Or why have we lost hygienists? Well, maybe because this situation's happened consistently. Why are we losing dentists? You know, it allows you to kind of look a little bit deeper than, oh, this is just so frustrating and I don't know what to do, which is what we immediately sometimes go to, is just like, well, I know everyone blames COVID. Oh, COVID screwed us over. Well, was it COVID or was it a lack of systems and structures in place? And did we actually manage our practice before and kind of continue to manage our practice? Or did we lose track of the things that we were doing during COVID that led us to where we are today? Because I think we blanket blame a lot in different areas, and it's nice to like see things on an actual non-emotional level, which is what KPIs are for, data. That it's like, oh, this is the actual reason, or these are similar, or I guess these are providing a picture of actual reasons of why there's patient turnover or employee turnover or cancellations or whatever. It just allows you to question.
Yeah, and I think this is why I personally love seeing KPIs tracked in a practice, because it allows you to get away from these conversations that are much more rooted in emotion, and frankly just gives you greater clarity on what actions you need to take, and just have an honest conversation, right, with regards to what's truly happening in your business. And one thing I want to mention, we tend to think, well, dentistry is unique, and it is. But some of the best organizations that you have products in your home from, so whether you're using Netflix, Google, all of these organizations, they actually track their numbers as well as their qualitative measures, like, for example, customer satisfaction ratings and returning customer rates. Very scientifically. So they spend millions of dollars a year on just tracking data. And I think it just goes to show why, the organizations that do track it end up doing much better overall, not just for themselves, but also for their customers, right? Because they can end up delivering a much better experience. And Uber is a great example of that, where if you interact with any Uber app or Lyft app, you often see not can you only review that particular individual, who's the driver, but you can also get feedback. And on the back end, you're tracking all of that data to determine which drivers they should keep in their network, which drivers should they reward, and then how are they planning on growing in new communities when they expand into other markets. So those are the operational KPIs. And then the last set of KPIs that I recommend that you track are clinical KPIs. And so these include treatment plan acceptance rate by provider. I look at the number of lab redos by provider as well. So sometimes you'll have, high redo rate, like particularly if you have an associate, for example, or a lab that's not, up to snuff as far as quality. So tracking this is important because it gives you an idea of what is the cost structure associated with that particular case. I also look at procedure mix by provider. So what percentage of the total procedures are preventative versus restorative. And then you can break down the specialties by looking at implants, oral surgery, and endo procedures. And some practice management systems allow you to get this information, others don't as easily. And so this is where having another tool that can display this data graphically may be able to assist you. Any questions on those first three, which is treatment plan acceptance, number of lab remakes, as well as procedure mix by provider? Okay. So the next one I look at is perio percentage, which is really the total perio divided by the total hygiene patients. And it gives you a sense of the hygiene department's health on a perio front. And then number of patients that are, percentage of patients that are probed by hygienists. And then last but not least, are you conducting, if you have a multi-provider practice, are you conducting chart audits? And if you're conducting chart audits, what is the minimum standard of care that you're looking at for that particular clinic, for the hygiene department, as well as for the DDS function? And generally, it's the owner of the practice or the principal that's conducting the chart audit. Obviously, hygienists have their own college. And so if you do decide to do hygiene chart audits, my recommendation is that they be conducted by a hygienist. On the dental front, it's important to note that in most provinces and territories, a principal dentist can dictate any sort of treatment that the associate should be doing, because each dentist has their own license and they're governed by that. The goal here is not to recommend you should be doing this treatment over another, but more importantly, just establishing guidelines for what is the minimum level of care they want to deliver to patients. And you want this to be much more, open-ended in terms of conversation and debate rather than dictatorial. Because I'm not a believer in one provider telling another one on the dental front, as far as DDS production, you should be doing these treatments. That's generally not even legal. So another question was, what is a chart audit score? It's actually not a dumb question. So the chart audit score is identified only after you establish your baseline for the quality of care. Teresa, do you want to maybe comment on your clinics conduct chart audits? Have you seen this happen in larger groups?
Yeah, so it varies. So some clinics are particularly good at doing chart audits where they'll sit down in the morning and they'll literally go through the entire day, daily huddle wise, and do their chart audits. And then I have other clinics that will do it privately on their own the night before. It just really, and then meet up quickly in the morning, the next morning before the day starts. It really just depends on your team and how you want to structure it. But the importance is chart audits, you should have a list of things that you want to keep as a benchmark to look at every day and then build on that foundation. So if your team is struggling with making sure that, I know it sounds really simple, but it happens in a lot of clinics. If they're struggling with getting a PA taken with every exam or taking a PAN with every COE, if they're struggling with doing something simple like, she's saying forecasting your day. Yeah, sort of. It depends what you mean by forecasting, because forecasting to me means looking at your numbers. But if you mean forecasting your day as in like picking treatment and seeing the chart audit, this person is due for hygiene and this person is due for treatment or has outstanding treatment, then yes, that's exactly what I mean. Going through each chart for each clinical dentist, RDH and RDA, and just providing a list of things that need to do. And some dentists lead that group and some have everyone else provide the information for the dentist. The dentist has a certain expectation and then everyone mines the information and brings it to the dentist. And other ways we've seen it where the dentist says, okay, what's going on with this patient, and asks the questions, and then everyone finds the information and talks about what they're going to do for the day. I particularly like when each provider takes care of their own chair and then mines the information to the dentist. And then the dentist goes, yes, this is what I'd like to see. This is how I want to run, because the dentist is really the clinical lead of that group and should be responsible ultimately for the care. And it puts more of the onus on the dentist to kind of engage on what's going on with the patients of the day. And it also helps the dentist keep on time. And I know there's dentists in this meeting tonight, so I'm so sorry I'm throwing you under the bus, but it's very useful for keeping dentists on time if they know where they need to be and what's going on in each appointment. It just gives them a little bit foresight of the day. And yeah, so that's kind of the chart audit systems that I've been familiar with and have worked really well. But I can tell you right now, if you're not doing chart audits, you're not maximizing your day, and you're probably just letting things go that you don't even realize you could be doing for your patients when they're here at the clinic, and then you end up having to pull them back. And we all know what it's like trying to get people back into the clinic. It's usually difficult at best. So getting everything done while they're in the clinic is like your first and foremost goal, so that you don't have to bring the patient back except for treatment, right?
Exactly. I think you nailed it there. So it is, tied to your clinical philosophy and clinical leadership. And, there's no two same methodologies for chart audits, but it's important to discuss collectively, what is it that we're aiming for, what's acceptable, right? As far as treatment outstanding versus treatment delivered, and then measuring against that. So that kind of summarizes the clinical KPIs. And then another question that came up is how much time would you allocate towards a morning huddle to determine all of this each day? So I'll give you my recommendation, and Teresa, you can chime in if yours differs. But I generally like to keep morning huddles to be ideally, 30 minutes or less. It all depends on, frankly, the number of providers that you have and the volume of the patients within your clinic. But what have you seen, Teresa, in your offices?
Yeah, pretty much the same thing. I think you should be happy with a 15-minute time zone if it's one dentist, two hygienists type of deal. I would hate to see it more than 15 minutes. That's just people having coffee break time, and I don't think that's productive. Although great for culture, so maybe that's what you do and that's how you want to run your practice. That's fine too. To have people kind of bring people together. If you're getting into the 30-minute zone, it's probably because you have 3 or 4 hygiene and maybe 2 dentists, or you're running one dentist is running 3 dental assistants. Then you're going to see, you have to make it longer for the amount of patients that you're seeing. As long as you're being thorough in what you're doing and productive with the day, your huddle time shouldn't matter a huge amount. Just make sure that it's producing for you, because if you're spending 30 minutes in a day, you should be recouping that throughout the day. That 30 minutes is going to pay off throughout the day because you're far more organized in your day. And you're, like we said earlier, you're completing as much treatment for that patient while they're there in the chair that day. And you're not having to bring them back, and you're not losing that potential production.
Yeah, great point. I think, if you're spending more than 15 minutes, you have to see some sort of a return on that time. Oftentimes when I've seen these huddles go longer is when there isn't a proper format in place, or people will arrive late for it. And so having, a structure in place really helps keep it on time. So with that said, I'll take any additional questions. My contact information is on the screen. So if you do have any questions after tonight, don't hesitate to reach out to me as well. And Teresa, thanks again for the opportunity to speak with the audience. Really appreciate it. And I'll kind of open up the lines to everybody for a couple of minutes before we wrap up.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions about their own clinic or things that they would like help with, now's the time to ask. Sina is like a fantastic resource. And I can't thank him enough for being a part of our meeting tonight, because it's just like awesome to have him here, and just rely a bit on his wealth of knowledge. It's a great resource for me always. But yeah, just thankful that he was able to participate with us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks again, Teresa. I appreciate your time, and everybody else as well. I know we're coming up on the hour. So everybody has my contact details. If I can be of any assistance to you, don't hesitate to reach out. This is a wonderful initiative. I love the fact, Teresa, you've brought together these great people to get really up to speed on what's going on in the industry. And I think that I wish more of these sorts of sessions happen all around the country, because we'd all be better off for it. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, it's awesome. Thanks again. If you guys need anything at all, Alberta wise, don't hesitate to reach out to us either. We can put you in contact with Sina. Like I said, get on his LinkedIn page. You're not going to regret it, because he's always pumping out stuff there that's good to read, and just stay up on that. Office management really is a profession, and the more we know, the better we can be at our jobs, and just do more and help our dental clinics grow and get out of the puke zone, sometimes I like to call it. So yeah, it's good to be a part of something a bit bigger, and office managers tend to be a bit on an island on your own, and this kind of helps us kind of bridge a little bit of the gap. So we have these meetings every second Monday of the month, and we have some cool people coming up. So join us on social media. We'll advertise who's going to be on there. It's optimizeddental.ca. to sign up. Obviously, everyone that signed up and registered will go on the automatic email and you'll see this out. So this video will be posted on YouTube in about a month once it gets edited and branded. But yeah, again, thanks so much, guys, for coming out tonight, and you enjoy the rest of your evening with your families and downtime.